There is a misunderstanding in modern culture that when an empath becomes quieter, slower, or more difficult to read, something must be wrong with them. That years of being unheard must have damaged something. That years of being misread must have hardened something. That years of being unseen must have hollowed something out. But that assumption reveals more about the culture than it does about the empath being judged. Because what years of being misunderstood actually do to a deeply feeling mind is far stranger, far more intricate, and far more powerful than most people are willing to imagine. The brain of the empath does not break under prolonged misunderstanding. It rearranges, it refines, it quietly rebuilds itself around a new operating principle. And what emerges from that rebuilding is something most observers will never know how to recognize. And this is where psychology becomes interesting. Most people have been taught to assume that emotional suffering simply leaves wounds, that long stretches of being unseen produce only damage, only deficit, only diminishment. And in some cases, that is true. But for the empath, something far more subtle tends to occur. Years of being misunderstood do not only carve scars, they carve perception. The mind that is repeatedly mislabeled begins, over time, to develop an unusual and almost surgical accuracy. Because when a person spends decades being interpreted incorrectly, they become extraordinarily attuned to the difference between what is real and what is merely projected onto them. They learn the texture of misreading. They learn the weight of being seen incompletely. They learn the strange and exhausting work of holding a self that others keep trying to redraw. And eventually, that work changes them in ways that cannot be undone. Modern culture has trained people to believe that emotional sensitivity is a vulnerability, a kind of soft architecture that the world inevitably erodes. So when an empath has been misunderstood for many years, observers expect to find a fragile person, a withdrawn person, a person who has been gradually emptied. But what they often find instead is something they cannot quite name. The empath who has been misread for decades is not empty. They are not bitter. They are not broken. They are simply different in a way that is difficult to articulate. Their attention has shifted. Their tolerance has shifted. Their relationship to noise, to people, to performance, to approval has all shifted. And the brain itself is part of that shift. What does a mind actually do when it is asked to hold itself together under decades of being seen incorrectly? Because a brain shaped by years of misinterpretation does not respond to the world the same way an unmisunderstood brain does. It listens differently. It calibrates differently. It conserves itself differently. There is a particular form of exhaustion that comes from being misunderstood for a long time, and it is not the exhaustion most people imagine. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the slow tiredness of being constantly translated by people who do not speak the language. The empath learns very early that their inner world does not arrive intact in other people's minds. The intensity becomes intensity of the wrong kind. The depth becomes moodiness. The care becomes over-involvement. The intuition becomes paranoia. The honesty becomes harshness. And the empath spends years performing small corrections, small clarifications, small acts of emotional translation, in the hope that one day the message will arrive in its actual shape. After enough years, that hope quietly thins. The empath begins to understand that translation is not always possible. Some inner languages do not survive the journey into another mind, and once that is accepted, a strange clarity arrives. Because if a part of you cannot be made legible to others, then a part of you was always going to belong only to you. That realization changes the shape of every relationship that follows. It looks like withdrawal, but it is actually refinement. The empath who has spent years being misread eventually stops investing equal energy in every interaction. They no longer rush to explain themselves. They no longer perform clarity for people who were never planning to receive it. They begin to choose where their inner life is permitted to land. And from the outside, that selectivity can be misinterpreted. It can look like coldness. It can look like distance. It can look like a person who has decided to care less. But underneath that quiet exterior, something far more sophisticated is happening. The brain is recalibrating its emotional economy. It is learning what is worth feeling deeply and what is not. It is learning where its sensitivity belongs. It is learning the difference between being open and being available, It is learning slowly that not every door inside a person is meant to swing open at the same time, and not every visitor is equipped to walk through them with care. That learning is the quiet beginning of a long internal reorganization, and this is the first quiet revolution that years of misunderstanding produce. Many empaths begin to live with a kind of internal precision the rest of the world cannot easily detect. Their reactions become smaller, but their perception becomes vast. Their words become fewer, but their inner commentary becomes layered and exact. They speak less about what they feel, because they have learned that what they feel rarely translates without distortion. So they keep more of it inside, not out of fear, but out of a deeper understanding that some things lose accuracy the moment they are spoken aloud. The empath becomes, in a strange way, fluent in private experience. And that fluency is itself a kind of intelligence. Because if you have spent years watching the world misinterpret your inner life, you eventually become an expert in the architecture of misinterpretation itself. You learn the patterns, you learn the triggers, you learn the small signals that tell you when your truth will be received and when it will only be twisted. That kind of awareness is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition earned at great cost. And once it forms, it does not go away. Once you understand this, a deeper question emerges. Here is what most people miss about the brain of an empath after years of being misunderstood. The brain does not simply protect itself. It begins to study the world that misread it. Years of mislabeling become, over time, an unintended education. Because every time an empath is misread, a small data point is filed away. Every time their kindness is mistaken for weakness, every time their depth is mistaken for melancholy, every time their silence is mistaken for indifference, the mind quietly takes note. And after enough of these moments, a long internal map begins to form. A map of how human beings interpret what they do not understand. A map of how unconscious people respond to consciousness. A map of how shallow systems describe deep ones. That map is not bitterness. That map is wisdom waiting to be recognized. It looks like silence, but it is actually sovereignty. Many empaths who have lived through years of being misread eventually stop trying to correct the record. They no longer chase the right interpretation from people who are not equipped to give it. They no longer explain themselves to those who have already decided who they are. And to the casual observer, this can look like surrender. It can look like a person who has stopped fighting for themselves. But that interpretation misses what is really happening. The empath has not surrendered. They have simply moved into a different relationship with truth. They have begun to understand that some truths cannot be argued into another person's mind. They can only be lived. And they have decided to live them quietly, without demanding witnesses. That is not a defeat. That is a quiet form of power most people never reach. There is another layer most people overlook. Years of being misunderstood teach the empath an entirely new relationship with language, because language, for most people, is a tool of connection. But for the empath who has been chronically misread, language has often been the very thing that betrayed them. The wrong word, said in the wrong moment, taken in the wrong way, has produced years of consequence. So the empath becomes careful, not anxious, not avoidant, careful. They begin to weigh words the way a craftsman weighs material. They notice the resonance of sentences. They notice what a single phrase carries and what it leaves out. They notice how easily a small remark can be inflated into a story that has nothing to do with the speaker's actual life. They notice the strange way certain words seem to invite distortion no matter how carefully they are placed. And after enough of this noticing, something shifts inside them. The empath stops using language to be understood. They begin using language to remain accurate. And that is a profound difference, because when you stop trying to be understood by everyone, you stop sacrificing accuracy for accessibility. You begin to speak in your actual voice, even when that voice is quiet. It looks like coldness, but it is actually clarity. Because when a person has been misinterpreted enough times, they stop reaching for warmth as a way to soften every exchange. They stop performing reassurance. They stop dressing their words to make others comfortable. And to those who are used to performance, the absence of performance can feel like distance. But it is not distance. It is honesty without decoration. The empath has simply learned that truth wrapped in too much softness often loses its shape. while truth spoken plainly tends to last longer. So they speak with fewer ornaments and more precision. And many people misread this as a person becoming harder. They are not becoming harder, they are becoming clearer. And clarity in a world built on performance can feel almost confrontational. That confusion is not the empath's problem to solve. Many empaths reach a quiet inflection point after enough years of being misread. The point at which they stop seeing their inner life as something to be defended in public. They stop arguing for their own depth. They stop offering proof of their goodness. They stop performing their sensitivity to convince others it exists. They simply carry it inside themselves, intact and uncontested. That is not resignation. That is the architecture of self-respect quietly assembling itself in private. And many people will never see that assembly. They will only see the surface, the quietness, the lower availability, the smaller social footprint. But what is actually happening beneath the surface is closer to a structural transformation. The empath is no longer building outward to be seen. They are building inward to be whole. And what is built inward cannot be misread, because it does not depend on outside interpretation to exist. Many empaths understand this without ever putting it into words. They simply feel themselves becoming more contained, more rooted, more difficult to disturb. Because if you know who you are, what exactly are you trying to prove? That question, when it finally lands, changes the shape of a life. Most people spend their years performing identity for an audience that is not paying close attention. The empath, after enough misunderstanding, stops paying that performance any further attention. They release it. And what remains is something rare. Self-trust deepens in privacy. Self-coherence deepens in privacy. Self-respect deepens in privacy, and empaths who have been misunderstood for years often arrive there long before anyone notices. They do not arrive there with celebration. They do not arrive there with announcement. They arrive there the way a tree finishes growing, in silence, in season, without applause. By the time the world catches up, the empath has already moved into a different country of the self entirely. And from inside that country, the old approval no longer reaches them in the same way. Now here is where it shifts, because what years of being misunderstood do to the empath's brain is not only a matter of refinement, it is also a matter of cost. Many empaths who carry this kind of quiet sovereignty did not arrive there gently. They arrived through long stretches of being unheard, of being misread, of being used as an emotional resource by people who never planned to return what they took. There is a cost embedded in this transformation, and the brain remembers that cost in ways that are not always obvious. There are nights when the empath feels older than their own face. There are afternoons when their stillness is not peace but exhaustion, learning to wear peace as a disguise. There is a particular fatigue that comes from being a person whose interior life is mostly invisible to those nearest to them. And this is where the psychology becomes even deeper. Because the empath's mind, after years of misunderstanding, begins to develop a kind of layered awareness most people never carry. They become aware of who is in the room and who is performing being in the room. They become aware of when a question is genuine and when it is a setup. They become aware of when affection is meant and when it is currency. This awareness is not chosen. It is built by repeated exposure to the gap between what people say and what they actually mean. The brain has been trained, against its preference, to read between every line. And reading between lines is a skill that does not turn off. There is a particular grief that accompanies this kind of awareness. It is the grief of seeing too clearly. Because once you can read what people are not saying, you cannot easily unread it. You see the small calculations behind certain smiles. You see the quiet retreat behind certain compliments. You see the borrowed warmth that disappears the moment a request goes unmet. And many empaths spend years trying to convince themselves they are imagining it, because believing what they actually perceive can be lonelier than pretending they do not. So they soften their own knowing. They give people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt has been earned. What does a sensitive mind do when its own perception keeps proving more accurate than the comfort of denial? Eventually, the cost of not believing themselves becomes greater than the cost of believing themselves. And that is the moment the empath quietly turns inward in a permanent way. It looks like distance, but it is actually discernment. The empath who has been hurt by people who weaponize vulnerability does not become closed. They become accurate. They develop an internal sorting system that most people never consciously build. They begin to notice the difference between someone who is curious about them and someone who is collecting information for later use. They begin to notice the difference between someone who values their presence and someone who values their availability. They begin to notice the difference between people who celebrate their depth and people who quietly resent it. That sorting system is not cynicism. It is the natural result of being misread by enough people who studied openness for leverage. The brain learned. And once it learned, it stopped offering itself the way it once did. It looks like walls, but it is actually boundaries. There is a profound difference between the two, and many people will never know it. Walls isolate, boundaries preserve. Walls keep everyone out indiscriminately. Boundaries decide who is allowed in and on what terms. The empath who has been chronically misunderstood eventually constructs the second kind, even if from the outside it can look like the first. Because what people see is reduced access. What they do not see is the careful intelligence behind that reduction. The empath has not stopped caring. They have stopped offering care to people who use care as raw material. They have stopped letting their feelings be redirected by people who do not feel back. That is not detachment, that is structure. And structure, after years of being structureless, is a form of self-rescue. There is also a quieter layer here, one that is rarely named. Years of being misunderstood often leave the empath with a complicated relationship to their own perception, because they have spent so long being told that what they noticed was not really there, that what they sensed was an exaggeration, that what they felt was too much. They sometimes begin to second-guess their own interior. This is the slow corrosion that prolonged misunderstanding causes, not the loss of feeling, but the loss of trust in feeling. And undoing that corrosion is the long, quiet work of the second half of life. The empath has to learn, often alone, that their perception was never the problem. The problem was the world insisting that depth report itself in shallow language. If this is resonating with you and you have ever wondered whether your sensitivity was a malfunction or a gift, you are not alone in carrying that question. It looks like retreat, but it is actually restraint. There is enormous power in restraint, and almost no one talks about it. The empath who has been misunderstood for years eventually develops the capacity to feel something completely without needing to broadcast it, to know something completely without needing to prove it, to perceive something completely without needing to argue for it. That capacity is rare. Most people, when they perceive something, immediately reach for confirmation. They look for someone to agree with them. They post, they explain, they justify. The empath who has lived long enough with misunderstanding stops needing that confirmation. They have learned that their perception does not require an external second opinion to be valid. They simply hold it. And that holding is a kind of strength most people will never see. The brain of the empath, after years of being misunderstood, is not the brain of a wounded person. It is the brain of a person who has been quietly educated by pain into a higher form of attention. And here is where the pattern resolves. Once you understand that misunderstanding does not damage the empath but transforms them, that withdrawal is refinement, that silence is sovereignty, that distance is discernment, a final truth begins to assemble. The years that the world spent misreading the empath were not wasted years. They were the years in which something was being built that the world did not have the eyes to see. Many empaths reach a point in life where they look back and realize that the long stretch of being misunderstood was the very thing that taught them who they were, that the misreadings were the chisel, that the lonely seasons were the school, that the people who reduced them were, in some painful and unrepayable way, the unwitting teachers of a self-knowledge they could not have gained any other way. This does not erase the cost. It simply names a strange truth. What does it mean for a person to be shaped most deeply by the very thing that hurt them most? It looks like insecurity, but it is actually self-possession in its early form. The empath who has been misunderstood for decades does not arrive at the end of that stretch as less. They arrive as more precise, more rooted, more difficult to manipulate, more aware of what is theirs and what is not. It looks like loneliness, but it is actually solitude. Loneliness is the absence of the connection a person craves. Solitude is the presence a person finally chooses with themselves. Many empaths spend the early decades of life inside loneliness, and the later decades discovering solitude. That movement is one of the great quiet transformations of a sensitive life. The empath learns that their own company, after years of being misread, is no longer a place of exile. It is a place of recovery. It is the one place where their inner life is allowed to exist in its actual proportions. No translation, no softening for the listener, no editing for the audience. Just the unbroken interior, finally welcomed by the only person who was always going to understand it. And this is the empowered resolution that many empaths arrive at, often without ever announcing it. They stop waiting to be understood. They stop building themselves around the project of being recognized by people who lacked the equipment to recognize them. They begin to understand that some forms of depth do not translate, and that this is not a tragedy. It is simply the nature of depth. Not everything that is real has to be witnessed to be real, and not everything that is true has to be defended to remain true. And the empath who has been misread for years learns this in the marrow of their being. What years of being misunderstood actually do to an empath's brain is build something that the world will never see in full and could never have given them anyway. They build a self that does not need permission to exist. They build a perception that does not need agreement to be accurate. They build an inner life that does not need an audience to be complete. And once that is built, it cannot be taken back. It cannot be undone by another misunderstanding. It cannot be eroded by another mislabeling. It has become structural. The peace that comes after years of being misunderstood is not a soft peace. It is not the peace of someone who has been treated gently. It is a more interesting peace. It is the peace of a person who has been read incorrectly so many times that they have given up on the project of being read correctly by everyone. And in giving up that project, they have recovered something far more valuable than universal understanding. They have recovered themselves. Many empaths arrive at this and find that the people who once misread them no longer have the same power. The old voices begin to grow quieter, not because they have apologized, not because they have changed, but because the empath has stopped lending them volume. The brain has stopped rehearsing their misinterpretations, and in that quiet, something extraordinary occurs. The empath becomes ungovernable by the opinions that once shaped them. They cannot be diminished by labels that no longer find purchase. They cannot be reduced by a misreading they have stopped agreeing to. They have entered a country of the self that prior misunderstanding cannot reach. The ability to remain whole after years of being misunderstood is strength. The ability to stop performing yourself for people who were never going to see you accurately is strength. The ability to carry depth without demanding witnesses is strength. The ability to live a quiet, accurate, unperformed life after decades of being mislabeled is the deepest form of strength most people will ever encounter, and most will never recognize it for what it is. That is sovereignty, and what most people interpret as the empath quietly disappearing is often the empath quietly arriving home. Being misunderstood for years is not the breaking of an empath. It is the making of one.